My mother stood on my nursing diploma and said, "Your sister needs the frame for her GED certificate." The diploma was laying on the kitchen floor under my mother's dirty gardening boots when I got home from my graduation ceremony that she refused to attend because my sister Kayla had a nail appointment. "What are you doing?" I watched her grind her heel into the paper, making sure to smear mud across my name and the official seal from the State Board of Nursing. 4 years of night classes while working 2 jobs and raising my daughter alone, and this was what I came home to. Kayla passed her GED test yesterday. She needs a nice frame for the wall so people know she accomplished something. My mother bent down and picked up my diploma, examining the tears her boots had made. "This frame is perfect. Real wood, not that plastic garbage from the dollar store." She started pulling at the corners, trying to separate the frame from my certificate. "That's mine. I just graduated 2 hours ago." I reached for it, but she turned away, shielding it with her body like I was trying to steal something from her. "You already have a job at the hospital. Kayla needs this for her interviews at the mall. First impressions matter, and she can't show up with some cheap frame. Besides, nursing isn't even that hard. You just follow doctor's orders all day." The certificate ripped as she yanked it free from the frame. Half of it stayed stuck under the glass while the other half fluttered to the floor. "There. Now Kayla can put her GED in here and hang it in the living room where everyone can see it." She held up the empty frame, admiring it. "Mom, I worked for 4 years for that degree. I missed holidays and birthdays studying for exams. I had to pay $30,000 in student loans." I picked up the torn pieces, trying to see if they could be taped back together. "And Kayla worked for 3 weeks to pass her test. That's determination. You've always been jealous of your sister's achievements. She needed extra time to find herself, and now she's ready to shine. You should be supporting her instead of making everything about you." My mother walked past me to get a dish towel to clean the glass. "Kayla is 28. She dropped out of high school to party and just now got around to finishing. She was exploring her options. Not everyone needs to follow the traditional path like you did. Some people are special and need room to grow at their own pace." She polished the frame until it gleamed. "Besides, you can just print another certificate online. They're all digital now anyway. Kayla only gets 1 GED certificate, and it needs to be displayed properly." My daughter Zoe came downstairs to see what the yelling was about. She was 6 and had made me a congratulations card at school with glitter and stickers. "Grandma, why is Mommy's paper ripped?" She picked up a piece from the floor. "Your mom is being selfish again. She won't share with Aunt Kayla, even though Aunt Kayla needs this frame for her important certificate." My mother took the piece from Zoe's hand and threw it in the trash. "But Mommy just graduated. My teacher said she should be proud." Zoe looked confused. "Your teacher doesn't understand family dynamics. Your Aunt Kayla has struggled more than your mom, so her accomplishments mean more. Getting a GED at 28 shows persistence. Getting a nursing degree is just following expectations." My mother patted Zoe's head like she was teaching her an important lesson. "I'm taking Zoe, and we're leaving." I picked up my daughter and grabbed my car keys. "You can't take her. I already told Kayla she could babysit tonight to practice for her interview at the daycare center. She needs to show she has experience with children." My mother blocked the door. "Kayla has never watched Zoe. She's never watched any child. That's discrimination. Just because someone doesn't have experience doesn't mean they can't do a job. You're always trying to hold your sister back." She crossed her arms like she was the victim. She got fired from the grocery store for stealing food. She was hungry and they weren't paying her enough. That's corporate exploitation. The daycare will be different because she'll be working with children, which is her calling. The doorbell rang and my mother rushed to answer it. Kayla walked in wearing pajama pants and a stained t-shirt at 3 in the afternoon. "Did you get my frame ready?" She didn't even look at me. I pushed past my mother's shoulder with Zoe pressed against my chest and got to the front door before she could grab my arm. Kayla was still standing there asking about her frame while I fumbled with the doorknob. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my keys twice. Zoe wrapped her arms around my neck and buried her face against my shoulder. I could hear my mother yelling behind me about how I was being dramatic and selfish, how I was making a scene over nothing. The door finally opened and I rushed down the porch steps to my car parked in the driveway. My mother followed me outside, still yelling. I got the back door open and tried to buckle Zoe into her car seat, but my fingers wouldn't work right. The buckle kept slipping through my hands. My mother was at the car now, banging on the window, telling me I couldn't just leave like this. Zoe started crying, asking what was wrong. I finally got the buckle clicked and slammed the back door shut. My mother moved to block the driver's side door, but I pulled it open anyway, forcing her to step back. She grabbed the door frame, trying to keep me from closing it. I got in and pulled hard until she let go. The engine started on the second try, too. I backed out fast enough that she had to jump away from the car. In the rearview mirror, I could see her standing in the driveway with Kayla next to her, both of them watching me drive away. I drove to the hospital where I just got hired and pulled into the parking lot because I didn't know where else to go. My hands were still shaking when I turned off the engine. The parking lot was half empty in the afternoon sun, and I just sat there staring at the employee entrance where I was supposed to start working in 3 days. Zoe's crying had quieted down to sniffles in the back seat. She asked why Grandma was so mean about my special paper. I turned around to look at her and saw her face was red and wet with tears. How was I supposed to explain this to a 6-year-old? I told her sometimes grown-ups have disagreements and Grandma was having a bad day. Zoe asked if Grandma was mad at us. I said Grandma wasn't thinking clearly right now and we needed to give her some space. That answer didn't satisfy her because she asked if we did something wrong. I felt my throat get tight and had to take a few breaths before I could talk again. I told her we didn't do anything wrong and that Mommy was very proud of her congratulations card. She asked where we were going to sleep tonight. I didn't have an answer for that one. I told her we would figure it out and everything would be okay, even though I had no idea if that was true. A woman knocked on my window and I jumped so hard I hit my knee on the steering wheel. It was Fiona from the hospital orientation last week. She was wearing scrubs and holding a coffee cup looking concerned. I rolled down the window and she asked if I was okay. I tried to say yes, but nothing came out except a weird choking sound. She opened the car door and crouched down next to me asking what happened. I started crying and couldn't stop. Everything just came pouring out about the diploma, and my mother standing on it and ripping it up for Kayla's frame, and how I didn't have anywhere to go. Fiona listened without interrupting and handed me napkins from her pocket. Zoe was quiet in the back seat playing a game on my phone that I didn't remember giving her. Fiona asked if I had family or friends I could stay with tonight. I shook my head because the only people I knew in town were at the hospital and I barely knew them. She said I could stay at her place tonight and we would figure out the rest tomorrow. I started to say I couldn't impose like that, but she cut me off saying she had a spare room and it was no trouble. She gave me her address and told me to meet her there in an hour after her shift ended. I thanked her about 5 times and she smiled and said, "That's what coworkers are for." We got to Fiona's apartment building at 6 and she buzzed us up to the 3rd floor. Her apartment was small but clean with pictures of her daughter on every wall. She set Zoe up on the couch with goldfish crackers and apple juice and turned on cartoons. Zoe seemed happy enough with that arrangement. Fiona made me sit at her kitchen table and poured me a glass of water. I tried to explain that I just needed one night to figure things out. She asked where all my stuff was, and I realized everything I owned was still at my mother's house. My clothes, Zoe's clothes, our important documents, everything. Fiona asked about my nursing shift starting soon, and I told her 3 days from now. She asked if I had money saved for an apartment. I had $800 in my checking account, which wasn't enough for first month, last month, and a security deposit anywhere in this town. Fiona pulled out her phone and started texting someone. She said her mom knew a landlord who sometimes helped hospital employees. I felt like I was drowning and someone had just thrown me a rope I wasn't sure would hold my weight. My phone started buzzing in my pocket around 7. I pulled it out and saw 12 text messages from my mother. The first one said I was overreacting and needed to come home right now. The second one said Kayla was crying because I ruined her special day by making everything about myself. The third one said I was being selfish and immature. The fourth one said I needed to apologize to both of them for causing a scene. The messages kept coming while I was reading them. My mother said she raised me better than this. She said I was setting a bad example for Zoe. She said family doesn't abandon family over small disagreements. She said Kayla worked hard for her GED and deserved to be celebrated. She said I always had to make everything about me and my accomplishments. She said if I didn't come home tonight, she would have to assume I was keeping Zoe from her grandmother on purpose. The last message said she would be calling the police to do a wellness check if I didn't respond in the next hour. I showed the messages to Fiona, and she said to ignore them. She said my mother was trying to guilt me into coming back. I put my phone on silent and set it face down on the table. The doorbell rang around 8, and Fiona answered it. An older woman who looked like Fiona, but with gray hair, came in carrying a casserole dish. Fiona introduced her as her mother, Shirley. Shirley set the casserole on the counter and came over to shake my hand. She said Fiona told her about my situation and she wanted to help. She said she knew a landlord named Bill who owned several properties near the hospital. She said Bill sometimes waived security deposits for hospital employees because his wife was a nurse and he knew how hard they worked. Shirley said she would call him tomorrow and set up some apartment viewings. She said I shouldn't go back to my mother's house if I didn't feel safe there. I tried to explain that my mother wasn't dangerous, just difficult. Shirley looked at me with this sad, knowing expression and said emotional abuse was still abuse. That word hit me like a truck. I had never thought of it that way before. Shirley said she would help me get back on my feet and I didn't have to do this alone. She stayed for dinner and we ate the casserole while Zoe colored at the table. It was the first time in hours that I felt like I could breathe properly. That night I lay awake on Fiona's couch staring at the ceiling. Zoe was asleep in the spare bedroom and the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I kept thinking about what Shirley said about emotional abuse. I thought about all the times my mother chose Kayla over me. When I made honor roll in high school and my mother missed the ceremony because Kayla needed a ride to her boyfriend's house. When I was accepted to nursing school and my mother said it was a waste of money because when Zoe was born and my mother spent the whole hospital visit talking about how Kayla would make a better mother someday. The diploma incident wasn't isolated. It was just the most obvious example of a pattern that had been going on my entire life. My mother had always made me feel like my accomplishments didn't matter as much as Kayla's needs. I had spent years trying to earn her approval, and it was never going to happen. That realization hurt worse than watching her destroy my diploma. I cried quietly into the couch pillow so I wouldn't wake anyone up. The next morning, I called the hospital HR department from Fiona's kitchen. A woman named Morgan answered, and I explained that I was a new hire starting in 2 days and I had a housing emergency. Morgan asked what kind of emergency, and I gave her the short version about leaving my mother's house unexpectedly. Morgan said the hospital had an employee hardship fund that provided short-term loans for situations like this. She said it was specifically designed to help new employees who were getting established. The fund could loan up to $3,000 with a low interest rate that would be paid back through paycheck deductions over 12 months. Morgan said she would email me the application right away, and I could submit it today. She said applications usually got approved within 48 hours if all the documentation was in order. I thanked her and hung up feeling like maybe this could actually work out. Fiona came into the kitchen and asked how it went. I told her about the hardship fund, and she said that was great news. She made eggs and toast for breakfast, and we were just sitting down to eat when someone started banging on the apartment door. The banging was loud enough that Zoe came running out of the spare bedroom looking scared. Fiona told her to stay in the kitchen and went to look through the peephole. She turned back to me and mouthed the word, "Mother." My stomach dropped. I had no idea how my mother found Fiona's address. The banging got louder and my mother started yelling through the door. She said I needed to come out right now and stop embarrassing the family. She said the neighbors were going to think she was a bad mother. She said I was being ridiculous and we needed to talk about this like adults. Fiona pulled out her phone and I thought she was going to call the police. Instead, she opened the door just wide enough to stand in the doorway blocking my mother's view of the apartment. I could hear my mother's voice getting louder, demanding to know if I was in there. Zoe grabbed my hand under the kitchen table and squeezed hard. Fiona told my mother that I was not available and she needed to leave the property. My mother's voice got even louder, saying she had a right to see her daughter. Fiona said calmly that this was private property, and my mother was trespassing. My mother tried to push past her, but Fiona stood her ground with one hand on the doorframe. She told my mother that if she didn't leave immediately, she would call the police and have her removed for trespassing and harassment. My mother started yelling about how Fiona had no right to keep a mother from her child. Fiona said I was an adult who had made it clear I didn't want contact right now, and my mother needed to respect that. She said if my mother continued this behavior, she would be calling the police and filing a report. My mother called Fiona some names I won't repeat in front of Zoe. Fiona pulled out her phone and started dialing. My mother finally stopped yelling, and I heard her footsteps going down the hallway. Fiona waited a full minute before closing and locking the door. She came back to the kitchen and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I was shaking again. Zoe asked if Grandma was going to come back. Fiona said no, and that we were safe here. I sat on Fiona's couch after she closed the door and my chest got tight. My mother knew where Fiona lived now. She could come back anytime. She could show up at the hospital. She could go to Zoe's school. My hands started shaking and I couldn't catch my breath. Fiona sat down next to me and told me to breathe slowly. She counted out loud while I tried to match her breathing. Zoe came over and held my hand, asking if I was okay. I nodded, but the panic kept building. Fiona got me a glass of water and made me drink it in small sips. She said we needed to talk to my supervisor at the hospital before my first shift. She said hospital security needed to know not to let my mother into my work area. I hadn't even thought about that. My mother could just walk into the hospital and find me. She could cause a scene in front of patients and coworkers. Fiona pulled out her phone and called someone. She talked quietly for a minute, then hung up and said her mother Shirley was coming over to help me look at apartments today. I tried to tell her it was too soon, but Fiona said the sooner I had my own place, the safer Zoe and I would be. Shirley showed up an hour later with a folder full of apartment listings. She was older than my mother but moved faster and smiled more. She hugged me like she actually cared and told Zoe she was a brave girl. We left Zoe with Fiona and drove to the first apartment. It was in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The building had broken windows on the second floor and trash in the parking lot. The landlord met us outside and showed us a one-bedroom on the third floor. The carpet was stained and the kitchen cabinets hung crooked. The rent was $900 a month plus a $1,000 deposit. I thanked him and we left. The second apartment was smaller but cleaner. The landlord said it was $750 a month, but he wanted first month, last month, and a deposit. That was over $2,000. I didn't have that kind of money. The third apartment was in a basement with one tiny window. It smelled like mold and the landlord kept staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl. Shirley grabbed my arm and we walked out. She drove me across town to a different building. She said she knew the landlord here and he was fair. The building was older but well-maintained. We walked up to the second floor and the landlord showed us a small one-bedroom. The kitchen was tiny but functional. The bathroom was clean. The bedroom would fit a double bed and maybe a dresser. There was a small closet. The living room had space for a couch and Zoe's toy box. The landlord said $800 a month. He said Shirley had vouched for me so he would waive the deposit and just need first and last month rent. $1,600. I still didn't have that, but it was better than anything else I'd seen. I went back to Fiona's apartment and filled out the hardship loan application on her laptop. The form asked about my emergency situation, and I wrote about leaving my mother's house unexpectedly. It asked how much I needed, and I put $3,000 to cover the apartment and have some left over for basic furniture. It asked about my employment, and I entered my new nursing position and start date. I attached my offer letter from the hospital and my nursing license. The form said applications were reviewed within 48 hours. I submitted it and felt sick to my stomach. I had just graduated and I was already begging for money. I had worked so hard to become independent, and here I was asking for help. But Zoe needed stability. She needed a safe place away from my mother's chaos. I reminded myself this wasn't about pride. This was about protecting my daughter from growing up the way I did. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was helping Zoe with a coloring book. It was Zoe's school. The secretary said someone had called claiming to be me and saying my mother had permission to pick up Zoe. The secretary wanted to verify because they had no written authorization on file. My stomach dropped. I told her absolutely not. I told her only I was authorized to pick up my daughter. The secretary said she thought it sounded suspicious, so she wanted to check. I thanked her and hung up. I called the school back and asked to speak to the principal. I explained that my mother might try to pick up Zoe without permission, and under no circumstances should they release my daughter to anyone but me. The principal said I needed to come in with my ID and fill out paperwork explicitly stating who was authorized. I grabbed Zoe and drove to the school immediately. The principal had me sign forms listing myself as the only authorized pickup person. She made copies of my driver's license. She said she would inform all staff that only I could collect Zoe. She asked if there were safety concerns, and I said my mother had become unstable. The principal nodded and said they would be vigilant. My first nursing shift started at 7 in the morning. I dropped Zoe at the before-school program and drove to the hospital. I changed into my scrubs in the locker room and reported to the nursing station on the medical surgical floor. My supervisor Giles introduced himself and showed me around. He was probably 50 with gray hair and tired eyes, but a kind smile. He assigned me to shadow another nurse for the first few hours. I tried to focus on learning the charting system and medication procedures, but I kept thinking about my mother. What if she showed up here? What if she caused a scene? I messed up entering a patient's vitals into the computer and had to redo it. Giles noticed and pulled me aside. He asked if everything was okay. I hesitated, then gave him the short version about my family situation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he understood and asked if I needed any schedule adjustments. He said he could put me on consistent shifts, so Zoe would have routine. He said he would inform security about my mother and make sure she couldn't access the floor. I thanked him and felt some of the tension ease. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing with texts. They were from Kayla. She said I was ruining her life. She said the daycare wouldn't hire her now because I wouldn't let her use Zoe as a reference for childcare experience. She said I was selfish and had always been jealous of her. She said I couldn't stand to see her succeed. The texts kept coming. She said I thought I was better than her because I had a nursing degree. She said I had always looked down on her. She said our mother was right about me. I blocked her number and put my phone away. I had to focus on work. I had patients depending on me. But the texts bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Part of me still hoped Kayla would eventually see how toxic our family was. Part of me still wanted a sister who cared about me. The next day, Fiona offered to go with me to get my belongings from my mother's house. My mother was supposedly at work according to her schedule. We drove over with Fiona's truck. When we pulled up, I saw garbage bags piled on the front porch. My stomach sank. We got out and I walked up to the porch. The bags were stuffed full. I opened one and saw my clothes. I opened another and saw Zoe's toys. My mother had packed everything like we were trash she was throwing out. Fiona started loading bags into her truck. I walked up to the front door and tried my key. It didn't work. My mother had changed the locks. I knocked, but nobody answered. I looked through the window and saw my mother sitting on the couch watching TV. She saw me and turned away. I knocked harder and she didn't move. Fiona came up behind me and put her hand on my shoulder. She said we should just take the bags and go. I nodded and helped her load the rest into the truck. We drove back to Fiona's apartment and started going through the bags. My nursing textbooks were gone. My laptop was gone. Several of Zoe's favorite toys were missing. I found a note in one of the bags. It was in my mother's handwriting. It said I didn't deserve nice things if I was going to abandon my family. It said she had given me everything and I threw it back in her face. It said Kayla needed the laptop more than I did for her job search. I crumpled up the note and threw it away. Fiona asked what it said and I told her. She said we should file a police report. I said nothing would come of it, but she insisted. She said I needed documentation of everything my mother was doing. We drove to the police station and I filed a report for destroyed property. The officer taking the report looked bored at first, but became more attentive as I explained. I listed the textbooks, the laptop, and Zoe's toys. I estimated the total value at over $1,500. The officer asked if I had proof of ownership, and I showed him photos on my phone of me using the laptop and Zoe playing with the toys. He wrote everything down. He said realistically they couldn't do much about property disputes between family members, but he said I should keep all documentation in case I needed a restraining order later. He gave me a case number and a copy of the report. Fiona and I left, and I felt slightly better having it on record. That evening, I was cooking dinner at Fiona's apartment when my phone started buzzing nonstop. I picked it up and saw I'd been added to a group chat. The chat had my mother, Kayla, and about 15 other family members. Aunts, uncles, cousins I barely knew. My mother had sent a long message saying I had abandoned her after everything she sacrificed to raise me. She said she put me through school and supported me, and this was how I repaid her. She said I was keeping Zoe away from her grandmother out of spite. She said she didn't know what she did to deserve such a cruel daughter. The messages started coming in from relatives. An aunt asked why I was being so mean to my mother. An uncle said family should stick together. A cousin said I should be grateful for everything my mother did. I read through them feeling sick. None of these people knew what actually happened. None of them knew about the diploma or the harassment or any of it. My mother had told them her version where she was the victim. I started typing a response, then stopped. Nothing I said would change their minds. They would believe my mother because that's what they always did. I left the group chat and blocked everyone who had messaged me. The next morning, Shirley showed up with her truck and 2 of her friends to help move my stuff to the new apartment. We loaded everything from the bags plus the thrift store furniture she'd picked up during the week. A scratched wooden dresser, a small kitchen table with mismatched chairs, a futon that smelled like someone's basement but was clean enough. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building across town near the highway where the rent was cheaper. 1 bedroom that I gave to Zoe, and a living room where I'd sleep on the futon. The kitchen was tiny with yellowed linoleum and cabinets that didn't close all the way. The bathroom had rust stains in the tub. But it was mine. Nobody could walk in and destroy my things or tell me I didn't deserve what I'd worked for. Zoe ran from room to room excited about having her own space. She picked the corner by the window for her bed and started arranging her remaining toys on the floor. I hung up her clothes in the closet and made her bed with the sheets Shirley had brought from the thrift store. Zoe found the glitter card she'd made for my graduation in one of the bags and taped it to her wall. She said it was to remind her that her mom was really smart. I had to leave the room for a minute because I couldn't let her see me cry. My first paycheck as a nurse came 2 weeks later, and most of it went to paying back the hardship loan. After rent and utilities, I had $300 left for everything else. Food, gas, Zoe's school supplies. I stood in the grocery store adding up prices in my head, trying to figure out how to make it stretch. Rice and beans were cheap. Pasta was cheap. I could get chicken legs instead of breasts. Store brand everything. Zoe needed new shoes because her toes were pushing through the front of her sneakers, but a decent pair cost $40. I put them in the cart, then took them out 3 times before finally leaving them on the shelf. We'd make her current shoes last another month somehow. I bought Band-Aids and duct tape instead, thinking I could patch the holes and pad the inside so they wouldn't hurt her feet. At the register, I watched the total climb and felt sick. $212 for 2 weeks of groceries, and I'd already compromised on everything. The cashier asked if I wanted to donate $1 to the children's hospital, and I had to say no even though I worked there. Walking to the car with my bags, I saw a mom loading name-brand items and fresh fruit into a new SUV and wondered what it felt like to not calculate every purchase. Zoe woke me up 3 nights in a row crying about nightmares. She dreamed that my mother was chasing us and we couldn't run fast enough. She dreamed that my mother took her away and I couldn't find her. She dreamed that my mother was mad, and it was Zoe's fault for being bad. I held her on the futon and tried to explain that sometimes grown-ups have problems that aren't about kids at all. That my mother's anger was about my mother, not about Zoe. But how do you tell a 6-year-old that her grandmother is toxic without making her feel like she lost something? How do you explain that leaving was protection, not punishment? I tried to keep my voice calm and not say anything mean about my mother even though I wanted to. Zoe asked if we did something wrong by moving away. I told her we did something right by finding a safe place. She asked if my mother still loved her. I said yes because that felt like the answer a kid needed to hear even if I wasn't sure it was true. She fell back asleep holding my hand, and I stayed awake staring at the ceiling wondering if I'd damaged my daughter by exposing her to that house for 6 years. Fiona knocked on my door on Saturday morning holding a big cardboard box. She said her daughter had outgrown a bunch of clothes and Zoe could have them if they fit. I tried to refuse because I didn't want to be a charity case, but Fiona pushed past me into the apartment and called for Zoe. They dumped the box on the floor and Zoe tried everything on like it was Christmas. Jeans that actually fit, shirts without stains, a winter coat that wasn't too small. Fiona waved away my attempts to pay her and said that's what friends do. That word hit me weird. Friends. I'd never really had friends before. In high school, my mother would find something wrong with anyone I brought around. They were too loud or too quiet or too interested in boys or not interested enough. She'd make comments until I stopped inviting people over. In nursing school, I was too busy working and studying to socialize. I'd convinced myself I didn't need friends because I had family, but family had been the problem all along. Fiona stayed for coffee, and we sat at my wobbly table while Zoe played with her toys in the bedroom. Fiona told me about her own mother who'd been controlling until Fiona moved out at 19 and didn't talk to her for 2 years. She said sometimes distance is the only thing that works. Sometimes you can't fix people who don't want to be fixed. My mother's social media posts started appearing in my feed even though I hadn't looked her up. Friends of friends sharing her stuff. Long paragraphs about ungrateful children who abandon their parents after everything that was sacrificed for them. About daughters who forget where they came from. About grandchildren being kept away for no reason. She never used my name but posted old pictures of me and Zoe from when Zoe was a baby. People commented with sympathy and support, telling my mother she deserved better. Telling her to stay strong. Telling her that kids these days have no respect. I read through every comment feeling sick. None of these people knew what actually happened. None of them knew about the diploma or the harassment or any of it. My mother had created a story where she was the victim and I was the villain, and everyone believed her because that's what she'd always done. I closed the app and deleted it from my phone. I didn't need to see that. My phone rang while I was giving a patient medication, and I let it go to voicemail. It rang again during my lunch break. Again when I was documenting in a chart. I finally checked and saw 17 missed calls from my mother's number. 17 voicemails. I listened to the first one. She was crying, saying she didn't understand what she did wrong. Saying she loved me and missed Zoe. Saying we should talk this out like adults. The second voicemail was angry. Saying I was being dramatic and selfish. Saying I was poisoning Zoe against her own grandmother. The third was back to crying. Saying she'd given up everything to raise me and this was how I repaid her. They went back and forth like that. Guilt trips and threats. She mentioned grandparents' rights in voicemail number 12. Said she'd been talking to a lawyer. Said she had rights to see Zoe whether I liked it or not. I sat in the break room shaking. I called Fiona and she told me to block the number immediately. That my mother was trying to manipulate me and I didn't have to listen to it. I blocked my mother's number and the silence afterward felt strange. Relieving but also scary, like waiting for the next attack. An older woman approached me at the nurse's station during my shift on Tuesday, asking if we could talk. She introduced herself as my mother's sister, though I'd only met her maybe twice in my life at family gatherings. She said she was worried about my mother, who was very upset about our situation. She said family is forever and I needed to forgive and forget, because that's what good daughters do. She said my mother made mistakes, but she was trying her best. She said Zoe needed her grandmother in her life. I felt people watching us. Patients in rooms nearby. Other nurses pretending not to listen. My face got hot and I told my aunt very quietly that I wasn't discussing this at my workplace. She said she'd driven an hour to talk to me and I owed her 5 minutes. She said my mother was falling apart and I was being cruel. I repeated that she needed to leave. She raised her voice, saying I was being disrespectful and unreasonable. Giles came around the corner and asked if there was a problem. My aunt said she was just trying to talk to her niece. Giles looked at me and I nodded. He called security and asked them to escort my aunt from the building. She argued the whole way, saying this was ridiculous and I'd regret this. After she left, Giles pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I said yes, even though I wasn't. He said if anyone else showed up bothering me at work to let him know immediately. That the hospital had policies about harassment, and he'd make sure they were enforced. Zoe's teacher sent me an email requesting a meeting to discuss some concerns about Zoe's behavior in class. My stomach dropped reading it. I scheduled the meeting for the next day during my lunch break and spent the whole night worrying about what was wrong. The teacher was young and nice and started by saying Zoe wasn't in trouble. She said Zoe had been withdrawn lately, not participating in activities she usually loved, sitting alone at recess, not talking to the other kids. The teacher asked if anything had changed at home. I explained about leaving my mother's house, about the family situation, about my mother trying to pick Zoe up from the school that one time. The teacher took notes and said she'd make sure the office had updated information about who was authorized to collect Zoe. She asked if Zoe was seeing a counselor, and I said not yet, but I was looking into it. She said the school had resources if I needed help finding someone. She said she'd keep an eye on Zoe and let me know if things didn't improve. I thanked her and left feeling like I was failing at everything. Failing to protect Zoe from the fallout. Failing to help her process what was happening. Failing to give her a normal, stable childhood. Morgan stopped by my workstation during my lunch break the next day. She said the hospital had an employee assistance program that included free therapy sessions. 6 sessions covered completely, and after that I could continue at a reduced rate if I wanted. I told her I'd think about it, but really I wasn't sure therapy was for me. Therapy seemed like something for people with serious problems, and I was just dealing with family stuff. Morgan wrote down the phone number anyway and left it on my desk. I stared at that paper for 3 days before I finally called and made an appointment. The receptionist scheduled me for Thursday afternoon, and I immediately regretted it, but didn't call back to cancel. The therapy office was in a building near the hospital with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room. I filled out paperwork asking about my childhood and current stressors and family relationships. My hand shook writing about my mother. A woman came out and introduced herself as Abigail. She had gray hair and kind eyes and led me to a small office with a couch and tissues on every surface. I sat down and she asked me what brought me in today. I started talking about the diploma and couldn't stop. Everything came pouring out. The frame and the boots and my mother blocking the door and Kayla showing up in pajamas expecting to babysit. I cried so hard I couldn't breathe properly. Abigail handed me tissues and waited until I could talk again. She asked questions about my childhood and how my mother usually treated me compared to Kayla. I told her about always coming second. About my mother missing my high school graduation because Kayla had a dentist appointment. About paying my own way through nursing school while my mother gave Kayla money for concerts and clothes. Abigail wrote notes and nodded. She said what I was describing sounded like patterns of narcissistic parenting. That my mother saw Kayla as an extension of herself and me as a source of support. That my feelings of guilt and obligation were normal responses to emotional abuse. The word abuse made me flinch. I said my mother never hit me. Abigail explained that emotional abuse was real abuse even without physical violence. That destroying my diploma was an act of aggression meant to diminish my accomplishments. That using Zoe as leverage was manipulation. I left that session feeling raw and exposed, but also strangely lighter, like someone finally believed me. I got home from my evening shift 3 days later and found Kayla sitting on the steps outside my apartment building. She jumped up when she saw me park. I locked my car doors and she ran over, banging on the window. She was crying and her makeup ran down her face in dark streaks. I cracked the window an inch and she started talking fast. Said mom kicked her out. Said she had nowhere to go. Said I had to let her stay with me because we're sisters and that's what family does. I asked why mom kicked her out. Kayla said mom was being unreasonable about her getting a job. Said she'd been applying places but nobody was hiring. Said mom gave her an ultimatum and then changed the locks when Kayla went out. I told her through the window that I couldn't help her. Kayla's face changed from sad to angry in a second. She started yelling about how I was a terrible sister. How I'd always thought I was better than her. How I was selfish and cold and didn't care about family. I got out of my car and walked toward the building entrance. Kayla followed me shouting. I went inside and she grabbed the door before it closed. I told her she needed to leave. She said she wasn't leaving until I agreed to help her. I said I'd call the police if she didn't go. She laughed and said I wouldn't, because then everyone would know what a horrible person I was. I took out my phone and started dialing. She finally backed away, still yelling about what a disappointment I was. I got inside and locked the door behind me. My hands shook so bad I dropped my keys twice trying to unlock my apartment. I was still standing in my doorway when my neighbor from across the hall came out. He was older, maybe 70, with white hair and glasses. He asked if I was okay. I said yes automatically even though I wasn't. He introduced himself as Cullen and said he'd heard the yelling outside. Asked if that woman was bothering me. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Cullen said he was a retired teacher and lived alone. Said he was home most days and would keep an eye out for anyone bothering me. Said to knock on his door if I ever felt unsafe. I thanked him and he went back inside. Having someone looking out for me made the apartment feel less isolated. I checked the locks 3 times before I could relax enough to make dinner. My second therapy appointment was the following Tuesday. Abigail asked how the week had been, and I told her about Kayla showing up. About feeling guilty for not helping her even though I knew letting her stay would be a disaster. Abigail said we needed to work on boundaries. That I wasn't responsible for fixing my mother or sister. That protecting myself and Zoe wasn't selfish. She gave me scripts for how to respond when family members tried to guilt me. Simple phrases I could use instead of explaining or defending myself. Things like, I understand you're upset, but I can't help with that, or I care about you, but I need to protect my own well-being. We practiced saying them out loud until they felt less awkward. Abigail said boundaries would feel uncomfortable at first because I wasn't used to putting my needs first. That the guilt would fade as I got stronger. I wanted to believe her, but the guilt felt permanent, like something I'd carry forever. The phone call came Thursday evening while Zoe was doing homework at the kitchen table. I didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. My mother's sister was on the other end. She said mom was depressed and not eating, that she was worried about her, that I needed to fix this. I felt my chest get tight. I used one of Abigail's scripts. Said I cared about my mother's well-being, but I couldn't have a relationship that harmed me and my daughter. My aunt said I was being dramatic, that every mother makes mistakes, that family forgives and moves on. I repeated that I couldn't help. My aunt's voice got sharp. She said I was selfish and cruel, that my mother sacrificed everything for me. I said I had to go and hung up. My hands were shaking again. Zoe looked up from her homework and asked if I was okay. I said yes and went to the bathroom so she wouldn't see me cry. Zoe asked about Grandma during breakfast on Saturday. Said her school play was coming up in 3 weeks and could we invite Grandma to watch? My heart sank. I sat down next to her and tried to explain that Grandma wasn't being kind right now, so we needed space from her. Zoe asked if Grandma was still mad about the frame. I said it was more complicated than that, but yes, kind of. Zoe nodded and went back to eating her cereal. She didn't push or ask more questions. She just accepted it and moved on. That scared me more than if she'd been upset. Made me wonder what else she'd noticed that I thought I was hiding. How much of the dysfunction she'd absorbed without me realizing. Fiona invited us to dinner at her mother's house on Sunday. I almost said no because being around other people felt exhausting, but Zoe got excited when she heard, so I agreed. Shirley's house was small and warm with pictures covering every wall. Fiona's dad was there and her younger brother and his wife. Everyone talked over each other in a friendly way and laughed at each other's stories. Shirley asked about my nursing work with real interest. Wanted to know what kind of patients I saw and whether I liked the emergency department or regular floors better. Nobody interrupted when I talked. Nobody made jokes at my expense or changed the subject to talk about themselves. Fiona's brother asked Zoe about school and listened to her whole story about her science project. At one point, I just sat there watching them interact and realized this was what healthy families looked like. People who actually cared about each other, who supported each other without keeping score. The contrast to my own family made my chest ache. The call came from a number I didn't know on Tuesday night. I answered and immediately regretted it. My mother's voice came through frantic and angry. She was calling from someone else's phone because I'd blocked her. Said Kayla got arrested for shoplifting at the department store. Said I needed to bail her out right now. Said this was my fault because I refused to help Kayla when she needed a place to stay. That Kayla wouldn't be stealing if she had family support. I said no. My mother's voice got louder. Said I was abandoning my sister in her time of need. That Kayla could go to jail. That I was heartless and selfish. I repeated no and hung up. Then I sat on my couch staring at the wall trying to convince myself I made the right choice. The guilt sat in my stomach like a rock. I kept thinking about Kayla in a cell scared and alone. Kept telling myself that bailing her out wouldn't help her learn. That she needed to face consequences for her actions. But knowing something logically and feeling it emotionally were two different things. I got to Zoe's school for pickup on Friday, and the office staff looked nervous when they saw me. The principal pulled me aside and said my mother had been there 20 minutes earlier. Said she tried to take Zoe claiming I'd given her permission. The school followed their protocol and called my cell to verify, but I didn't answer because I was driving. They refused to release Zoe and my mother made a scene. Yelled about her rights as a grandmother, threatened to call her lawyer. Security had to escort her off school property. My stomach dropped. I asked where Zoe was and they brought her out from the office. She ran to me and wrapped her arms around my waist. Her whole body was shaking. She asked why Grandma tried to take her. Why Grandma was so angry. I held her and told the principal I needed copies of all their documentation, that I'd be filing for a restraining order. The principal nodded and said they'd already updated their records to be extra careful. I took Zoe home and she didn't let go of my hand the entire drive. I went to the courthouse the next morning with everything organized in a folder. The police report from the school incident, screenshots of every text message and voicemail, photos of my destroyed diploma, the documentation from the hospital about my mother showing up at my workplace, the school's written statement about the attempted pickup. I handed it all to the clerk at the filing window and filled out the forms requesting a restraining order. My hands shook writing down each incident, but I made myself include every detail. The clerk reviewed my paperwork and told me a judge would see me within the hour for the emergency hearing. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom watching other people come and go with their own legal problems. A woman with a black eye. A man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. I wondered if they could tell just by looking at me what kind of family situation had brought me here. The bailiff called my name and I walked into the courtroom feeling like I might throw up. The judge was an older woman with reading glasses and she looked tired. I stood at the table and answered her questions about why I needed protection. Described my mother standing on my diploma. The harassment after I moved out. The attempt to take Zoe from the school without permission. My voice cracked when I talked about how scared Zoe had been. The judge looked at my evidence for what felt like forever. Then she signed the temporary restraining order and scheduled a hearing for the permanent one in 3 weeks. She told me to document any violations and report them immediately. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt strange. Relieved, but also guilty. Like I'd just done something terrible to my own mother even though I knew I was protecting my daughter. Zoe woke up screaming that night. I ran to her room and found her sitting up in bed crying about Grandma trying to take her away. I held her and turned on the nightlight and told her she was safe. That Grandma couldn't come to her school anymore. She asked why Grandma was acting so mean, and I didn't know how to explain it in a way a 6-year-old could understand. I told her that sometimes people we love make bad choices that hurt us. That it doesn't mean we're bad or that we did something wrong. She asked if Grandma still loved her, and I said yes, but that love doesn't always look the way we think it should. She had the same nightmare the next 3 nights. Each time I went through the same routine of holding her and reassuring her until she fell back asleep. During the day, she seemed okay, but she started asking to sleep with her light on. Started checking the locks on the doors before bed. I hated that my mother had done this to her. Had made my daughter scared in her own home. The first letter arrived 5 days after I got the temporary restraining order. My cousin dropped it off saying my mother had asked her to deliver it. I opened it and saw pages of my mother's handwriting. The first paragraph blamed me for tearing the family apart over something as stupid as a picture frame. Said I was being dramatic and selfish. The second paragraph switched to begging. Said she missed Zoe so much she couldn't sleep. That she was sorry if she'd upset me, but I was overreacting with the restraining order. The third paragraph went back to anger. Called me ungrateful after everything she'd sacrificed for me. Said I'd regret this when she was gone and it was too late to make things right. I put the letter in a plastic bag and added it to my documentation folder. 2 days later, another letter came through a different relative. This one was shorter but followed the same pattern. Blame, then guilt, then threats. I documented that one too. A week later, a third letter arrived with photos of Zoe from when she was a baby. My mother had written on the back about how much she loved being a grandmother and how cruel I was to keep Zoe from her. I took photos of each letter with my phone and then drove to the police station. The officer who took my report was the same one from the school incident. He remembered me and looked at the letters with a serious expression. Told me these were clear violations of the restraining order, that he'd file reports and forward them to the prosecutor. Asked if I felt safe at my apartment and I said yes, but I was worried about what my mother might do next. He gave me his card and told me to call immediately if she showed up anywhere near me or Zoe. I left the station feeling watched even though I knew my mother wasn't following me. Just the knowledge that she was out there trying to find ways around the order made me constantly look over my shoulder. I had a therapy session with Abigail that afternoon. Told her about the letters and the police reports, about the guilt that sat in my chest every time I documented another violation. Abigail asked me who was choosing to violate the court order. I said my mother was. She asked me who was choosing to harass me through relatives. I said my mother was. She asked me who was choosing to ignore a judge's ruling meant to protect me and my daughter. I started crying because I knew what she was trying to make me see, but it still felt like I was the one hurting my mother by getting her in legal trouble. Abigail reminded me that my mother had options. She could respect the boundaries. She could get her own therapy. She could work on herself instead of blaming me. Every choice to violate the order was hers alone. I wasn't responsible for the consequences of her actions. I nodded, but the guilt didn't go away. It just sat there in my stomach like something heavy I couldn't digest. The permanent hearing date arrived 3 weeks later. I put on the nicest clothes I owned and made sure I had all my documentation organized. Walked into the courthouse and saw my mother sitting on a bench with Kayla. They were both dressed up like they were going to church. My mother's hair was done and she wore makeup. Kayla had on a dress I'd never seen before. They looked like respectable people dealing with an unreasonable daughter. My mother saw me and her face did this thing where she looked sad and hurt, like I was the one who'd wronged her. Kayla glared at me and whispered something to my mother. I sat on the opposite side of the hallway and waited for our case to be called. When the bailiff said my name, I stood up and walked into the courtroom. My mother and Kayla followed. The same judge from before was presiding. My mother's lawyer went first and painted me as an overprotective daughter who was keeping a loving grandmother from her only grandchild. Said the whole thing started over a misunderstanding about a picture frame. That my mother had made a mistake in a moment of excitement about Kayla's achievement, but didn't deserve to be cut off from her family. Made it sound like I was the problem, like I was vindictive and cruel. The judge asked me to present my case. I walked up to the table with my folder and started going through everything. Showed her the photos of my destroyed diploma with the boot prints still visible on the paper. Played the voicemails where my mother called me selfish and threatened to take Zoe. Read the text messages where she said I'd ruined Kayla's life. Presented the school's written statement about the attempted pickup. Showed the police reports from that incident. Then I laid out the 3 letters that had violated the temporary order, showed the dates and the relatives who delivered them. Explained how each letter had followed the same pattern of blame and guilt and threats. The judge looked at everything carefully. Asked my mother's lawyer if he had any response to the documented violations. He said my mother was just trying to reach out to her daughter. That she didn't understand the legal technicalities of the restraining order. The judge looked at my mother and asked if anyone had explained to her what a restraining order meant. My mother said yes, but she thought it was just about not showing up in person. The judge told her that no contact meant no contact through any means, including third parties. Then she signed the permanent restraining order for 3 years. Said if my mother violated it again, she'd face criminal charges. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt everything at once. Relief that I had legal protection now. Grief that it had come to this. My mother walked past me in the hallway and said loud enough for me to hear that I'd regret this someday. That Zoe would grow up and realize what kind of person I really was. Kayla called me a word I won't repeat. I kept walking to my car and sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes before I could make myself turn the key. I'd protected Zoe and myself. But I'd also accepted that I didn't have the mother I'd always wished I had. That the person who raised me was never going to change or see what she'd done wrong. It felt like mourning someone who was still alive. Kayla found me on social media 2 days later. Sent me a message saying she was sorry things had gotten so bad between us. That she wanted to fix our relationship. I read it and felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe my sister was finally growing up. Then I kept reading. The message turned into accusations about how I'd always been jealous of her. How I'd turned our mother against her. How I owed her money for emotional distress. I blocked her on that platform and she found me on another one. Same pattern. Started apologetic, then became angry and demanding. I blocked her everywhere I could find and told Abigail about it in my next session. Admitted that part of me had been hoping Kayla would eventually understand. That she'd see how toxic our family dynamic was and want something different. Abigail asked me what evidence I had that Kayla wanted to change. I couldn't think of any. Every interaction we'd ever had followed the same script. She wanted something from me and got angry when I wouldn't give it to her. 3 months after moving out, I finally felt like I could breathe. Work had become routine in a good way. I knew my coworkers and they knew me. Giles gave me shifts that worked with Zoe's school schedule. I was paying back the hardship loan on time and even had a little money left over at the end of each month. Not much, but enough that I didn't panic every time an unexpected expense came up. Zoe seemed happier too. She wasn't checking the locks obsessively anymore. Wasn't having nightmares every night. She'd made friends at the school and talked about them at dinner. Asked if kids could come over for a play date. I said yes and felt proud that I could offer her that. That we had a home where she felt safe enough to invite friends. The apartment was still small and the furniture was still secondhand, but it was ours. Nobody was going to destroy my things or make Zoe feel bad about existing. That mattered more than having nice stuff. Cullen knocked on my door on a Saturday morning and asked if Zoe and I wanted to come to a neighborhood barbecue that afternoon. Said several families were getting together in the courtyard, and there'd be kids for Zoe to play with. I almost said no because being around groups of people made me tired. But Zoe heard him through the door and got excited, so I agreed. We went down at 2 and there were maybe 15 people standing around a grill. Kids running between the adults playing tag. Cullen introduced us to everyone and people were friendly without being nosy. Asked what I did for work and seemed genuinely interested when I said I was a nurse. One woman said her daughter was in Zoe's grade at the school, and the 2 girls recognized each other. They ran off to play, and I stood there talking to the adults about normal things. Jobs and weather and the broken elevator that needed fixing. Nobody asked about my family or why I'd moved here. Nobody made me feel like I had to explain myself. After an hour, Zoe came running up saying she'd made a friend named something I didn't catch, and could they have a play date. The other mother smiled and said that sounded great. Gave me her number and suggested next Saturday. I said yes and felt something close to normal for the first time in months. I contacted the nursing school the next week about getting a replacement diploma. The woman on the phone said it would cost $50 and take 6 weeks to process. I paid with my credit card even though I needed that money for groceries. When the new diploma arrived in its cardboard tube, I bought a simple black frame from the discount store and hung it on the wall in our apartment living room. Standing back to look at it gave me this feeling in my chest like I was taking back something that belonged to me. Zoe came over and stared at it for a minute, then said it looked really nice up there where everyone could see it. I told her it was staying there forever and nobody was going to touch it. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. Giles pulled me aside during my shift 2 days later and asked if I wanted to pick up extra hours on weekends. He said one of the other nurses had to cut back her schedule and they needed coverage. I thought about it for maybe 5 seconds before saying yes. The after-school program Zoe attended now stayed open until 6 on weekdays and offered Saturday care too. The extra money meant I could pay more than the minimum on my student loans each month. I worked that first extra Saturday and came home with an additional $200 on my paycheck. It felt like breathing room I hadn't had in months. My therapy session with Abigail that week focused on something she called grief work. She kept using that phrase, and at first I didn't get what she meant because nobody had died. But she explained that I was mourning the mother I always wanted to have, the one who would have been proud of my nursing degree and helped me celebrate instead of destroying my diploma. The one who would have chosen me sometimes instead of always choosing Kayla. Abigail said accepting that this mother didn't exist and never would was a kind of death. That protecting Zoe from the same treatment wasn't me being mean or holding grudges. It was me being a good parent by breaking a cycle. I cried through most of that session, but afterward I felt lighter somehow. Zoe's teacher, Mrs. Anderson, called me in for a meeting the following week. I drove to the school convinced something was wrong, but she smiled when I sat down. She said Zoe had been doing much better lately. Her schoolwork was back on track and she seemed happier during class. Mrs. Anderson mentioned that Zoe had started helping other kids who looked sad or left out at recess. She would invite them to play or share her snacks without being asked. I sat there listening and realized my daughter was learning what kindness looked like by watching me set boundaries. That standing up for yourself didn't make you mean. It made you strong enough to help other people too. The letter came on a Tuesday in a pale blue envelope with my aunt's return address. I opened it standing by the mailboxes in the apartment lobby. My mother's sister wrote that my mother had some kind of health scare last week. She didn't say what kind, but mentioned the hospital and tests. The letter asked if I would reconsider the restraining order because my mother needed family support right now. I read it twice, then went upstairs and called my aunt back. I explained as calmly as I could that my mother had other family members who could help her, sisters and cousins and friends from church. But I couldn't be that person for her anymore. My aunt tried to argue, but I told her my decision was final and hung up. My hands shook for 10 minutes after, but I didn't cry. Fiona invited me to lunch the next Saturday when we both had the day off. We went to this little sandwich place near the hospital and talked for 2 hours. She told me she was proud of how far I'd come in just a few months, that she remembered finding me crying in the parking lot, and now I seemed like a completely different person. I said I didn't feel that different, but she disagreed. She pointed out that I had my own place and was managing my money and standing up for myself, that I was building a life instead of just surviving. Having someone witness my progress who wasn't being paid to listen meant something I couldn't quite explain. Fiona hugged me when we left and said she was glad we were friends. I realized I was glad too. My 6-month work anniversary fell on a Thursday. I took Zoe out to dinner at the Italian place she liked with the breadsticks. Nothing fancy, but we got appetizers and dessert, which we never did normally. Zoe told me between bites of pasta that she was proud of me for being a nurse and helping sick people feel better. She said her teacher had asked the class what their parents did for work, and she got to tell everyone about me. I looked at my daughter sitting across from me in the booth and understood she was learning what real success looked like. Not the version my mother taught where you got praise for doing the bare minimum. The version where you worked hard and earned things and felt good about what you accomplished. Shirley stopped by my apartment the following week with a folder full of papers. She said the hospital had a scholarship program I should know about. They would pay some of my student loan balance if I agreed to work there for 3 more years. She helped me fill out the application right there at my kitchen table. We submitted it online that same day. 2 weeks later, I got an email saying I'd been accepted. The program would cover $5,000 of my loans. It wasn't everything, but it meant my monthly payments would be smaller, and I'd pay the whole thing off faster. I called Shirley to thank her, and she said that's what friends do for each other. Abigail and I had what she called a breakthrough during our session in early December. We were talking about the restraining order and how I still felt guilty sometimes about getting it. She stopped me and asked what exactly I thought I should have done differently. I couldn't answer because when I really thought about it, I had tried everything. I'd set boundaries and my mother ignored them. I'd explained how her behavior hurt me and she dismissed it. I'd offered chances to have a relationship if she would just treat me with basic respect, and she refused. Abigail pointed out that my mother had countless opportunities to change and chose not to every single time. That the restraining order wasn't me giving up on her. It was me finally accepting who she actually was instead of who I wanted her to be. Something clicked in my brain right then. The guilt didn't disappear completely, but it got quieter. Zoe and I started doing movie night every Friday after that therapy session. I'd make popcorn in the microwave and we'd pile blankets on the couch and watch whatever movie she picked. Usually something animated with talking animals or princesses. During the second movie night, she curled up against me and said this was her favorite place to be. Not the movie or the popcorn, but here in our apartment with just the 2 of us. I kissed the top of her head and realized we'd built something good from all the broken pieces. Our little apartment with its secondhand furniture and discount store frames was more of a home than my mother's house ever was. We were okay. We were going to be okay. I ran into Fiona in the break room the next week and she poured herself coffee while telling me about her grocery shopping trip. She said she saw my mother in the produce section looking through the discount bin. Fiona described how my mother's hair was greasy and her clothes looked like she'd been wearing them for days. She said my mother was talking to herself and putting bruised apples back because they cost too much. I felt something twist in my chest hearing that. Part of me wanted to drive to that grocery store and make sure she was eating properly. The other part knew I couldn't save someone who refused to admit they needed help. I thanked Fiona for telling me and went back to checking patient charts. That afternoon, I focused on taking Zoe to her soccer practice and helping her with her math homework and making dinner in our little kitchen. The life we were building mattered more than the one I left behind. 2 days later, I searched online for support groups and found one that met Tuesday evenings at a community center across town. The website said it was for adult children of narcissistic parents, and I sat staring at those words for 10 minutes before filling out the contact form. The group leader called me that same night and explained how the meetings worked. She said I could just listen if I wanted, and didn't have to share anything until I felt ready. Tuesday came and I dropped Zoe at Fiona's place, then drove to the community center with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. 8 people sat in a circle in a room that smelled like coffee and old books. The group leader welcomed me and asked if I wanted to introduce myself. I said my name and that I'd recently cut contact with my mother. A woman across from me nodded like she understood everything I wasn't saying. For the next hour, I listened to people talk about holidays ruined and accomplishments dismissed, and being blamed for things that weren't their fault. One man described how his mother showed up at his wedding and made a scene about the seating arrangements. Another woman talked about her father calling her selfish for moving to a different state for a better job. Every story felt familiar in a way that made my throat tight. When the meeting ended, 3 people came up to tell me it gets easier. The woman who nodded earlier hugged me and said she was 5 years into no contact, and finally sleeping through the night. Driving home, I felt less alone than I had in months. The group leader texted me the next meeting date and I saved it in my phone. 5 months after leaving my mother's house, I had enough money saved for a small trip. I told Zoe we were going to a state park 2 hours away for the weekend, and she jumped up and down in the living room. We packed sandwiches and juice boxes and her favorite stuffed bear. The park had hiking trails and a lake and campsites with fire rings. Zoe held my hand while we walked through the woods looking at birds and interesting rocks. She asked questions about every tree, and I made up answers when I didn't know the real ones. That night, we roasted marshmallows over the campfire and she got sticky sugar all over her face. She looked at me in the firelight and said this was the best adventure ever. I felt something warm spread through my chest that wasn't just from the fire. We slept in the tent listening to crickets, and in the morning we ate cereal from plastic bowls while watching the sun come up over the lake. Zoe said she wanted to come back here every year and make it our special place. I promised her we would. Money is still tight most months, and I still have moments where I doubt every choice I've made. Sometimes I wake up at 3 in the morning wondering if I should have tried harder to fix things with my mother. I still grieve the relationship I wanted where she would be proud of my nursing degree and help me raise Zoe and act like a normal grandmother. That version of my mother doesn't exist and probably never did. But Zoe is doing better in the school and making friends and learning what healthy relationships look like. I'm building a career at the hospital, and Shirley helped me get promoted to a position with better hours. We have Fiona and her family and Cullen next door, and the people from my support group who understand what it's like. I'm learning that the family you choose matters more than the family you're born into. Protecting my peace isn't selfish. It's necessary for both of us. We're going to be okay.